One quiet morning, as James stepped out of his farmhouse to load supplies in his truck, he was aghast. The only bridge that connected his farm to the main road was gone. Not damaged, not blocked, completely gone, erased from existence it seemed overnight. There had been nothing but a gaping void over the creek that cut through his property, the water below churning higher than usual after the recent rain. James just stood there, staring at the spot where the bridge should have been, trying to wrap his head around something that couldn't possibly be. Who would do such a thing, and why? Besides being a convenience, that bridge was a lifeline for James. Without it, his farm was basically cut off from the world. Deliveries wouldn't come. He couldn't get his equipment across. Even his truck, loaded with tools for the day's tasks, was stuck on the wrong side of the creek. It wasn't some rickety old footbridge either, but a sturdy, well-maintained wooden bridge his father had rebuilt decades ago, strong enough for trucks, trailers, anything a working farm needed. And now it was just gone. James' first thought was that it must have been an accident, some kind of misunderstanding. Perhaps a construction crew had torn it down by mistake. Perhaps the county had plans for some kind of replacement he hadn't been informed about. But as he made call after call, that hope started to unravel. County officials knew nothing about it. Neither did the Department of Transportation. No permits had been issued for work in the area. Nobody had any record of contractors being sent out. It was as if the bridge had been stolen in the dead of night, and no one had noticed. Anger had overcome frustration and confusion when James' neighbor, an older gentleman up the road, brought up something strange he'd seen the day before. Construction crews working near James' property, men with heavy machinery ripping up wood and hauling it away. But here was the kicker that sent James' blood boiling. Bill had said he'd seen Karen, the president of the local HOA, directing the whole thing. The local HOA, the very same one James wasn't even a part of. Karen was a name James knew well, though not fondly. Her reputation for overstepping boundaries wasn't a secret in the area. She had a knack for turning small issues into neighborhood-wide crusades, all under the guise of protecting property values. Over the years, Karen had filed plenty of complaints about James' farm, though it was wholly outside HOA jurisdiction. She had once left a note in his mailbox claiming his barn was an eyesore visible from HOA properties and was bringing down the aesthetic standards of the community. James had laughed it off at the time, thinking she couldn't actually do anything about it. His farm had not been subject to HOA regulations. He had made sure of that when he had bought it. But now, while standing and staring at the now empty creek where his bridge used to be, James was not laughing anymore. He made his way, which was a long way around, to Karen's, having to wind his way through back roads and cutting across a neighbor's field with their permission. An hour plus later, he finally pulled up to her perfectly manicured suburban home. Already at his breaking point, she greeted him as she had before, with that smug look, standing on her porch, like the queen of the neighborhood. But before James could complete a sentence, Karen was already interrupting him, with that particularly irritating smile on her face. "Oh, James," she said in that exaggeratedly sweet tone, "I was just about to call you. I hope you are not too upset about the bridge. I thought you would consider it an improvement." "Improvement?" snapped James, his voice rising. "You tore down my bridge without permission. How is that an improvement?" Karen didn't bat an eyelash. "Well, it wasn't exactly up to HOA standards, was it? We've been discussing your property at the last few meetings, and it was decided that the bridge was an eyesore, unsafe, too. We're just trying to bring your property up to code." James could hardly believe what he was hearing. "I'm not part of the HOA. You don't have any say over my property." Karen leaned her head to one side, as if he were the one being unreasonable. "Your property borders the HOA," she said matter-of-factly. "It's visible from several of our homes, and we all felt it was in the community's best interest to address the issue. You're welcome, by the way." James' hands clenched into fists. "You had no right." Karen cut him off again. "Oh, don't worry. We're working on plans for a new bridge, something more in line with HOA guidelines, of course. There will be some costs involved, but I'm sure you'll agree it's worth it." "Costs?" She wanted him to pay for this? James felt like he was stuck in some kind of bad dream. I'm not paying for anything. You had no authority to touch my property, let alone destroy my bridge. You're going to replace it exactly how it was, at your expense. Karen's smile finally faltered, but only for a moment. Well, she said, her tone turning icy, if you're going to be difficult about it, perhaps we'll have to reassess how your property fits into the community. It might be time to revisit the annexation proposal. Annexation. The word sent a chill down James' spine. He knew the HOA had tried and failed to expand its boundaries to include his farm years before he bought it, but the thought of Karen reviving that plan in an attempt to strong-arm him into compliance made his stomach churn. James walked out of Karen's house angrier than ever. Driving back home, he couldn't help but feel this was only just the beginning. Karen's actions didn't seem like a one-time occurrence. They felt calculated and deliberate. She wanted something from him, and she wasn't beyond playing dirty in order to get it. By the time James turned onto his property, frustration had given way to an icy resolve. If Karen thought that she could now bully him into submission, then she had another thing coming. He wasn't going to let some power-hungry HOA president take away what his family had worked generations to build. Still, a nagging question lingered in the back of his mind: what was Karen's real endgame? James didn't have the answer yet, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. It wasn't until I confronted Karen about the bridge that things really started to turn into a nightmare. I had at first thought that the removal of the bridge was a mistaken act of Karen playing too big for her britches as HOA president. Perhaps she actually thought she was helping the community, as ridiculous as that sounded. What I found out subsequently showed this wasn't about aesthetics or safety, this was about control. Karen didn't just want the bridge gone, she wanted my land. It was the morning following our confrontation, and while checking my mailbox, this official-sounding letter shows up, complete with a large HOA stamp across the top. What it meant, through all this legal lingo mumbo-jumbo, was, due to its proximity alone, that my property fell under a classification of being subject to special compliance evaluations, all for not keeping in check, from improper maintenance, the failure in aligning its entity to community-set standards, etc. The kicker? It said at the bottom of the letter that I would be charged for the bridge removal project, as well as any future improvements necessary to bring my property into compliance with the HOA. My blood boiled. Not only was Karen threatening to make me pay to destroy my own property, she was acting like the HOA had some kind of authority over my farm. I was not a member. My land was not under their purview. None of it was making any sense. My attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, said the same. This letter is complete garbage, she said to me over the phone. The HOA can't just make up rules for properties outside their boundaries. Karen's bluffing. While it was reassuring to hear Linda say so, I just had this feeling Karen didn't sound like an individual who would easily back down. And if this afternoon was anything to go by, things were about to escalate rather rapidly. That afternoon, a crew of surveyors came onto my property. They didn't even knock on my door, let alone ask for permission. They parked their truck right at the edge of my field and started hammering stakes into the ground, marking off sections of my land. When I approached them to ask what was going on, one of them shrugged and told me that they had orders from the HOA. I burst out in anger. The HOA has no authority here, I shouted. This is private property. Get off my land. The men looked at each other uneasily before gathering up their equipment and finally leaving. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling in my stomach that something was really wrong. Karen was pushing me, testing the limits to see how far she could go. And if she was willing to send surveyors onto my property without permission, what else might she be planning? I was determined to get answers, and so I began investigating Karen's background. I spoke to other neighbors, particularly those who had lived in proximity to the HOA for several years. What I heard was both infuriating and terrifying. It turned out that Karen had a reputation for bullying her way to forcing homeowners to comply with her wishes. Over the years, she had orchestrated campaigns to annex properties into the HOA, using everything from nuisance complaints to outright harassment to force people to join. One recalls how she had fined him thousands of dollars for infractions, including having a boat parked in his driveway, although his property wasn't technically part of the HOA. Another remembers how Karen filed complaints to the county over unsafe structures on his property, until he was forced to sell, unable to pay his way through a legal battle. A pattern was forming. Karen was targeting anyone who was an obstacle to her vision for the neighborhood. And now it seemed my farm was her next target. The more I pieced together about Karen's history, the more I wondered, what was her endgame? Why did she care so much about controlling properties that weren't even within the HOA? The answer came when I happened upon an old article from the local paper. Years ago, prior to Karen's presidency of HOA, she had tried to buy a big plot of land in order to extend her own. That land, I now realized, was my farm. Karen had lost that bidding war against the previous owner, my father. Everything started to click in place. Karen's obsession with my property wasn't just because of HOA rules or aesthetics. It was very personal. She had wanted the farm for herself, and now she was using her position in the HOA to get what she couldn't buy. Fueled by this revelation, I decided to fight back. I compiled every piece of evidence I could find: Karen's fake compliance letter, the surveyor incident, testimony from neighbors who had been harassed by the HOA. I even managed to track down a former HOA board member who admitted that Karen had been pushing for an annexation plan behind closed doors for years. According to the former board member, it called for bringing properties from around them into HOA control so they could inflate their budget and expand their sphere of influence. But just when I thought I had Karen cornered, she pulled another stunt that left me reeling. One morning, as I was reviewing my notes with Linda, a sheriff's deputy pulled into my driveway. The deputy handed me a notice. Karen had filed a complaint, accusing me of threatening her during. After their confrontation, Karen claimed that James had yelled obscenities, made aggressive gestures, and even implied physical harm. Of course, none of it was true, but the complaint was enough to initiate an official investigation. James was furious. Karen wasn't just playing dirty, she was trying to paint him as the villain. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt. What if she managed to turn the law against him? What if her lies convinced the authorities to side with her? But James wasn't about to let Karen win. He gave the deputy copies of his evidence, including footage from his security cameras that showed the surveyors trespassing on his property and Karen's contractors removing the bridge. The deputy seemed skeptical of Karen's claims but warned James to be cautious. "She's not going to stop," the deputy said. "People like her never do." By the end of the day, James was more determined than ever to take Karen down. She might have started this fight, but he was going to finish it. He just hoped he could do it before she caused any more damage. James had been fighting Karen's ridiculous schemes for weeks, but nothing could prepare him for the sheer audacity of her final move. It happened on a rainy Tuesday morning when a huge certified letter arrived in his mailbox. The return address read HOA Legal Department, which made James roll his eyes at first. But when he opened the envelope, the contents made his blood run cold. It wasn't anymore that the HOA wanted to fine him, or even muscle him into compliance. The letter outlined a formal eminent domain claim. Karen and the HOA were claiming that James' farm was necessary to community development, and should be forcibly annexed into the HOA for the greater good due to its proximity to the neighborhood. They wanted his entire property under their control, fields, barn, even his house. And if he refused to voluntarily sign over his land, they would take him to court and fight for it. James stood there for a moment in the rain, holding on to the letter, and tried to digest what he had just read. He was disbelieving, angry, and something else he didn't want to admit: fear. To what lengths was Karen prepared to go? Could she win an argument like this? When James brought the letter to his lawyer, Linda, she looked furious but not surprised. "I've seen this kind of thing before," she told him. "It's a scare tactic. They don't have the legal grounds to pull this off, but they're banking on you being too scared or tired to fight back." Tired was an understatement. James was exhausted mentally, emotionally, and even physically. had been dealing with Karen's harassment for weeks on end, always on edge, never knowing what she'd pull next. But hearing Linda's confidence lit a fire in him. If Karen thought she could bully him into submission, she was about to get the fight of her life. The courtroom was packed the day of the hearing. James had not expected the case to blow up this huge, but Karen had been quite eager to make an issue of it. She arrived with her customary smirk, flanked by the HOA's lawyer and a small contingency of board members. They certainly had the appearance of a team ready to win. Yet James was not alone either. She had a mountain of evidence to support their argument: surveillance videotape of the surveyors trespassing on his property, the fabricated compliance letter Karen had provided, and testimony from neighbors galore who suffered Karen's bullying at first hand. Even James had documents proving that his property was entirely outside the HOA's boundaries, along with old county maps to show that the HOA had no legal claim to his farm. At the beginning of the hearing, the HOA's lawyer did his best to argue that James' property was a public nuisance and annexation would be a great boon to the community. Even Karen took the stand to spout her usual nonsense about how James' farm was bringing down property values and creating an eyesore for residents. But Linda was ready. When it was her turn, she tore down every argument the HOA had made. She proved to the court that James' property was well taken care of, his farm was there long before the neighborhood was ever built, and Karen's actions were no more than a personal vendetta disguised as community interest. Then came the twist James hadn't seen coming. As Linda presented the last bit of evidence, she let something out that was quite shocking to all who were present in the room, including James. As it would turn out, Karen's ultimate goal wasn't just about annexing the farm for the HOA. She had filed paperwork to buy the property herself. The plan was simple: force James off his land through HOA harassment, then swoop in and buy the property at a fraction of its value. The courtroom fell silent as Linda held up the purchase agreement Karen had tried to keep hidden. It was dated weeks before the bridge had been removed. Karen's face went bright red as the judge asked her for an explanation, and she stammered, trying to say that it was some sort of misunderstanding, but the damage was done. The HOA board members looked furious, knowing they'd been dragged into some kind of personal vendetta Karen had. It did not take him very long to find in James' favor. The judge said that the HOA had absolutely no authority over James' property, and ordered Karen to pay for a bridge replacement cost, along with a huge fine for trespassing and harassment. But what really made this a victory was when he referred Karen's actions to the county for further investigation. If the authorities find her actions fraudulent, which quite clearly it was, she may be looking at some serious criminal charges. The fallout was quick. Days later, Karen was gone as president. A spate of resignations by supportive board members took place, and the HOA was pretty much the neighborhood pariah. In the process, James became something of a local folk hero for fighting against them. The best of it came several weeks later when Karen showed up herself at James' farm. She didn't come to apologize this time but stood at his driveway edge, glaring as workers completed what she had torn up a bridge. He just sat and watched as she finally turned and walked away from the total devastation of her plan. As the workers packed up and headed off, James stood on the new bridge, looking out over his farm. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. Karen had tried to take everything from him, but in the end, she'd only destroyed herself.